The Ashbourne River ran deeper that season than any Nellie could remember. Rain had fallen for 3 straight days over the northern hills, and the water rushing down the slope carried branches, silt, and the sharp smell of upturned earth. Nellie already had her boots soaked to the ankle when she heard the sound. Not a bark, not a whimper, but something caught between the two. A sound she recognized before she even saw the shape drifting along the riverbank. It was a wolf. Large, dark gray fur matted with mud, her belly visibly swollen and heavy. She was alive, but barely. Her front paws scraped at the muddy bank and found no grip. The current pulled her slowly, steadily, the way rivers pull at things they have already decided to keep. Nellie didn't think. She dropped her herb basket on the bank, waded into the water up to her waist, and reached for the wolf's hind legs. The current was stronger than it looked from shore, and for a moment her feet lost the riverbed entirely. She kicked, pulled, grabbed the soaked fur with both hands, and pushed with everything she had in her shoulders and back. The wolf weighed more than anything Nellie had ever carried, but she dug her heels into the mud beneath her and did not let go. When they finally reached the bank, Nellie was on her knees in the mud, gasping, her blonde braid undone and plastered across her face. The wolf lay on her side, flanks rising and falling in short, unsteady breaths. Her eyes were gold, still conscious, and they looked directly at Nellie for one long moment before closing. "Stay still," Nellie said quietly, the way she always spoke to injured animals that appeared at the edge of the forest. "I won't hurt you." She worked quickly. She had the habit of carrying linen strips and compress herbs, even when she went out only to gather. Her grandmother had taught her that. The forest doesn't warn you when it's going to need you. She ran careful hands over the wolf's belly. The pups were alive. She could feel faint movement beneath the taut skin. There was no visible external wound beyond shallow cuts along the flanks, likely from branches. The problem was the cold, the exertion, the shock. Nellie pulled the gray cloak from her own shoulders and laid it over the wolf. It was all she had. She stayed there for over an hour, warming the animal's flanks with her bare hands, murmuring the low, meaningless words one murmurs to someone who is afraid. The rain had thinned to a fine mist. The smell of the river, pine resin, and wet fur mixed in the cold afternoon air. She didn't notice she was no longer alone until she heard the branch snap behind her. Nellie turned her head slowly. 3 men stood on the bank, no more than 10 paces away. They were not ordinary men. She felt that before she processed any visual detail. There was a weight to their presence that made the air feel thicker, a quiet and utterly still quality that animals had when they were observing before they moved. The first was the youngest of the 3, brown-haired, with an expression of mild amusement, and his arms crossed over a chest covered in dark leather with metal clasps. The second was broader, with a dense red beard, and his eyes fixed on the wolf with an expression Nellie could only describe as barely contained relief. The third stood 1 step ahead of the other 2. That one was different. Tall, very tall, with black braids falling over a dark fur-lined cloak held in place by leather straps crossing his chest. His eyes were a blue so pale they appeared almost colorless, and they were watching Nellie with an attention she didn't know how to name. Not surprise, not anger. Something more careful than either of those. Something deliberate, like a man who already knows something you haven't yet said. She was drowning, Nellie said, because the silence was too heavy, and she needed to fill it with something true. "I know," said the man with the black braids. Deep voice, controlled. 2 words only, but they carried an authority so natural that Nellie felt the instinct to lower her gaze. She resisted it. The red-bearded man had already knelt beside the wolf and was running his hands over her belly with a gentleness surprising for someone his size. He murmured something very quietly that Nellie didn't catch, not the northern dialect she knew. "The pups are alive," he said, lifting his face. His eyes were red at the edges, the look of someone who had been holding something back for too long. All three. You warmed her, said the youngest, watching Nellie with open, undisguised curiosity. With your own cloak, in the middle of winter. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, made in the tone of someone noting something unexpected. She was cold, Nellie answered simply. And you weren't? He said, the corner of his mouth rising. She was. Deeply. Her lips had already lost sensation, and her fingers ached in that slow, hollow way she knew would take hours to pass. But that had not seemed relevant beside a pregnant wolf dying of cold in the mud. The man with the black braids had moved closer without her noticing the motion. He stood 3 paces away now, and at that distance the weight of his presence was even more real. Dark wood, leather, and something wilder beneath both, like the forest after a storm has passed through it. He looked at the wolf, then at Nellie, then at the gray cloak she had taken from her own body. What is your name? He asked. Nellie, she said, from the village of Grent, 2 leagues south. Nellie of Grent, he repeated, slowly, as though placing the name somewhere deliberate. Do you know what this wolf is? Nellie looked at the animal covered by her cloak. The dark gray fur, the unusual size. The gold eyes now closed, but breathing with more steadiness than before. A pregnant wolf who was drowning, she said. A wolf of the royal guard, said the youngest behind her, his tone carrying an even mix of amusement and weight. She belongs to the king's pack. She escaped this morning during transport. We have been searching for hours. Nellie was quiet for a moment. She's all right now, she said finally. Or she will be. She needs warmth, clean water, and rest. The pups should come within 2 days if I'm reading the size of her belly correctly. The red-bearded man made a low sound that could have been a laugh or a suppressed sob. The man with the black braids was still watching Nellie. He had a way of looking that needed no movement to feel like pressure, something between assessment and recognition, as though he were seeing the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked aloud. You tend to animals, he said, not a question. I tend to whatever comes injured, she answered. Something always does. Yes, he said very quietly. Something always does. The young brown-haired man approached the wolf with a thick blanket from his travel pack and spread it over the animal, returning Nellie's gray cloak with a simple gesture. She took it and pulled it back over her shoulders, feeling the soaked fabric cold as a second skin. We'll transport her carefully, said the red-bearded man, already organizing his arms beneath the wolf's body with a competence that suggested he had done this before. She can't walk. She shouldn't be moved for at least an hour, Nellie said, before she could stop herself. The shock is still in her body. If you move her now, you may lose the pups. All 3 men stopped. The man with the black braids turned his face toward her again, and this time something in his expression had shifted. A sharper attention, more specific. An hour, he repeated. At the very least. Nellie held his gaze, though something in her recognized she was being bold in a way that might not be entirely wise. I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn. It's only what I know. You didn't speak out of turn, he said. Silence. The mist continued fine over the river. Somewhere in the forest a bird called once and went quiet. The wolf drew a deep breath, her flanks expanding with more ease than before, and one of the pups shifted visibly beneath the skin of her belly. The red-bearded man made a low sound and pressed one open palm to the wolf's belly with a tenderness entirely out of proportion to his size. An hour, he agreed, his voice rough. Nellie sat on the riverbank, wrapped in her wet cloak, beside a wolf of the royal guard, surrounded by 3 wolves whose names she still did not know. The man with the black braids settled a short distance away, forearms resting on his knees, and said nothing. But it was not the silence of someone with nothing to say. It was the silence of someone paying far more attention than he was showing. Neither of them spoke for a long time, and somehow, that silence weighed more than any conversation Nellie had carried in recent memory. The hour passed slowly, the way hours do when the air is cold and the company is unexpected. Nellie kept her hands on the wolf's flanks, monitoring the rhythm of her breathing, checking the temperature of her ears and paws at intervals. The pups moved twice more beneath the skin, strong, deliberate movements that eased the tension in her chest considerably. The wolf would be all right. The wolf's body knew what it was doing, and sometimes that was enough. The red-bearded man had not moved far from the animal's side. He sat cross-legged in the mud without any apparent concern for his clothing, which told Nellie something about him. Men who cared about appearances did not sit in riverbank mud. He watched the wolf with the focused, quiet attention of someone who loved the animal, and was too proud to say it plainly. The youngest of the three had introduced himself at some point during the second half of the hour, casually and without ceremony, the way people do when they are trying to make a situation feel smaller than it is. "Davin," he had said, dropping down onto a log nearby with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to making himself comfortable anywhere. "And the large, emotionally compromised one in the mud is Cade." He raised her from a pup. "He will not admit that he cried when she disappeared this morning, but I am telling you now so the record is accurate." Cade had not looked up from the wolf. "Say that again, and I'll put you in the river." "You see," Davin had said pleasantly, turning back to Nellie, a man of few words and enormous feeling. "We are all very fond of him." Nellie had almost smiled. Almost. The man with the black braids had said nothing during this exchange. He had remained where he was, a short distance from the group, close enough to observe everything, and far enough to make clear that the distance was a choice. He had not told her his name. She had not asked. There was something about him that made asking feel like a different kind of question entirely, as though the name itself would change the weight of the afternoon, and some instinct in her wanted to hold off that change for as long as possible. She already knew, in the wordless way that the body knows things before the mind catches up, that whatever this man's name was, it would mean something. Something she was not ready for yet. When the hour had passed and the wolf's breathing had steadied into a deep, regular rhythm, Cade lifted her from the ground with careful arms, the blanket wrapped securely around her body. The wolf stirred but did not struggle. Her gold eyes opened briefly and found Nellie's face, and there was something in that animal gaze, a recognition, a calm, that made Nellie's throat tighten unexpectedly. "She remembers you," Davin said quietly, watching the same thing. "She'll be all right," Nellie said, more to herself than to him. "Because of you." Nellie stood, brushing mud from her dress and trying to restore some order to her undone braid, with fingers that were only beginning to feel like her own again. She retrieved her herb basket from where she had dropped it on the bank. Several of the bundles were scattered and damp, but salvageable. She began gathering them back into the basket with the methodical focus of someone who needed something ordinary to do. "Where will you take her?" she asked. "North," said Cade, already moving carefully along the bank with the wolf in his arms, choosing each step with deliberate attention. "To the king's stronghold. 2 hours' ride." Nellie nodded and said nothing more. She had done what needed doing. The wolf was stable. The pups were alive. Her part in this was finished. She turned south toward Grent. She had taken perhaps 7 steps when the voice reached her. "Nellie of Grent." She stopped, turned. The man with the black braids stood where she had left him, and he was watching her with that same quality of attention, the kind that had weight and direction, the kind that landed somewhere specific. "The wolf will whelp tonight or tomorrow," he said. "I would like you there." Nellie looked at him for a moment. "I'm not a midwife," she said. "I know what you are," he said. And then, after a pause that felt entirely deliberate, I know what you did here today. I want someone who knows what they're doing when she delivers. Cade will not sleep until those pups are in the world and breathing. Neither will I. There was no performance in it. No flattery, no elaborate persuasion. Just a direct statement of need, offered without apology and without pressure. He was asking. She could say no. The asking and the not pressing were both completely clear. Nellie thought about Grant, about the small house at the edge of the village, the hearth that would take an hour to warm back up, the wet boots she would have to dry by the fire. She thought about her friend Mara, who would ask where she had been and why she looked like she had been dragged through a river. And Nellie would have to decide how much of this afternoon to explain. She looked at Cade walking ahead with the wolf, the careful way he adjusted his arms so the animal's belly was fully supported. She looked at the man with the black braids. "I'll need my basket," she said. "You have it," he said. "And I'll need proper supplies. What I have here is limited. We have everything you'll need at the stronghold. And I want to leave when it's done," she said clearly. "When the pups are safe and the mother is stable. I go home." Something moved in his expression. Not resistance, not offense. Something she might have called respect, if she had been bolder about naming it. "Agreed," he said. Davin appeared at her left shoulder from nowhere, offering her a dry riding cloak from his own pack with a wide, genuine smile. "You'll want this. The road north is colder than the river, I promise you." She took it, pulled it over her wet one, and fell into step with them. It was only when they reached the horses tethered in the tree line, tall, dark animals with the calm, certain temperament of creatures accustomed to war, that Davin brought his horse alongside hers and leaned over with the conspiratorial ease of someone sharing a secret they fully intended to share. "You really don't know who he is," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," she said. Davin smiled slowly, not unkindly. "You will." The road north was indeed colder than the river. The mist had thickened into a low gray ceiling over the hills, and the trees on either side of the road grew denser and older the farther they rode. Oaks so wide at the base that 3 people couldn't have circled them with joined hands, their branches bare and black against the pale sky. The earth smelled of pine and wet stone and wood smoke from somewhere distant. Nellie rode in the middle of the group. Cade was ahead, still carrying the wolf, his horse moving at a walk so smooth it barely disturbed the sleeping animal in his arms. Davin rode beside Nellie and talked with the easy, rolling rhythm of someone who had made a personal mission out of filling silence. She learned that Cade had been with the pack for 20 years and communicated primarily through facial expressions and mild threats. She learned that the stronghold they were riding toward was called Vordenmere, and that it sat on a ridge above the forest with a view of 3 valleys and a river that did not flood. She did not learn the name of the man riding slightly ahead and to the right, who had not spoken since they left the river, and whose presence she was aware of with an accuracy that irritated her slightly because she could not explain it. She could have been blindfolded and still known exactly where he was. The stronghold appeared first, as torchlight above the tree line. Amber points burning against the gray dusk, then the shape of stone walls rising from the ridge, massive and old, the kind of construction that did not announce itself, but simply existed in the landscape, as if it had always been there, as if the ridge had grown up around it rather than the other way around. Banners hung from the battlements, deep charcoal with a silver mark she couldn't read from the road. The gates opened before they reached them. Guards in dark leather stood at attention on either side, and as the man with the black braids rode through without slowing, Nellie watched every single one of them drop their chin to their chest in a gesture that was not a bow. It was something older and more total than a bow. It was the gesture of wolves acknowledging something above rank. Nellie's horse passed through the gate into a wide stone courtyard lit by iron torch brackets, and she looked up at the banners close enough now to see the silver mark clearly, a wolf's head, a crown above it. She looked at the back of the man riding ahead of her. The black braids, the dark fur cloak. the way every person in this courtyard had gone still the moment he entered. Davin pulled his horse alongside hers with the timing of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Roman," he said pleasantly. "His name is Roman, king of the Lycan courts, lord of the northern packs, sovereign of the Vordenmere throne." He paused. "In case you were still wondering." Nellie held the name in her mind for a moment. Then she looked down at her mud-stained dress, her river-soaked boots, and the damp herb basket hanging from her saddle. "Of course he is," she said quietly. Vordenmere was not what Nellie had expected, though she would have struggled to say exactly what she had expected. The great hall was built from dark stone that had absorbed decades of torch smoke and firelight, until the walls themselves seemed to glow amber from within. The ceilings were high and vaulted, crossed by thick beams of ancient oak, and from those beams hung the banners of a dozen packs: charcoal, deep green, burgundy, black, their silver and gold markings catching the light each time the fires shifted. Long tables ran the length of the hall, scarred by years of use, and the smell of the place was layered and dense. Roasting meat, pine resin, candle wax, old leather, and beneath all of it, that particular warm and wild scent that Nellie was beginning to associate specifically with this pack, with these walls, with the man who ruled them. She did not linger in the hall. Cade carried the wolf directly to a chamber off the eastern corridor, a room that had clearly been prepared for this purpose, or perhaps simply maintained as a place where animals were brought when they needed care. Clean straw on the floor, thick blankets, a fire already burning in a low hearth, iron hooks on the wall holding dried herbs in bundles. Nellie recognized most of them. Whoever stocked this room knew what they were doing. She set her basket down and got to work. The wolf, whose name she learned from Cade in the gruff, minimal way he communicated most things, was Sable, had begun to show the early signs of labor by the time they settled her onto the prepared bedding. Her breathing had deepened and slowed, the kind of breathing that had intention in it. Her gold eyes were open and calm, tracking movement in the room without distress. "She trusts you," Cade said, from his position against the wall where he had planted himself like a piece of furniture. "She doesn't trust easily." "She doesn't have reason to distrust me yet," Nellie said, checking the temperature of the room with her palm. "That's different from trust." Cade looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe," he said, and then said nothing else. Davin had brought the supplies she asked for: clean linen, warm water, specific herbs for the compress, a small knife with a clean blade, and an extra lantern that he hung from the iron hook above the bedding with the competence of someone used to making himself useful in practical situations. He did all of this without being asked twice, and without filling the room with unnecessary noise, which revised Nellie's estimate of him upward considerably. Roman stood in the doorway. He had not entered the room. He stood at the threshold with his arms at his sides and watched Nellie work with that same quality of attention she had felt on the riverbank, precise, undemonstrative, and entirely undisguised. He was not pretending to look elsewhere. He was watching her, and he seemed to have no particular interest in concealing the fact. Nellie kept her attention on Sable, and tried to ignore the way the space at her back felt different when his gaze was on it. The first pup arrived an hour after midnight. Nellie had delivered animals before: goats, sheep, a horse once, under circumstances she preferred not to revisit. But there was something about this that was different in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. Perhaps it was the intelligence in Sable's eyes throughout, the way the wolf seemed to understand what was happening and cooperate with it, rather than simply endure it. Perhaps it was the quality of the silence in the room during the final, focused minutes. Cade rigid against the wall, Davin crouched nearby with his jaw set, and Roman, who had finally stepped across the threshold and stood at the edge of the light without a word. The pup was small and dark gray, already moving before Nellie had finished clearing the sack, and when it made its first sound, a small, indignant noise that was more squeak than howl, the exhale that moved through the room was audible. Cade turned away briefly. When he turned back, his eyes were very bright, and Nellie decided with complete sincerity that she had not seen anything. The second pup came 30 minutes later, the third an hour after that. By the time the last pup was nursing, and Sable's breathing had eased into the deep, exhausted rhythm of an animal that has done something enormous and survived it, the fire in the hearth had burned low, and the quality of the darkness outside the narrow window had shifted from deep night toward the pale, tentative edge of early morning. Nellie sat back on her heels and let out a long breath. "All three," she said. "She's well. She'll be tired for several days and she needs clean water and food available at all times, but she'll recover fully." Cade crossed the room in 3 strides, crouched beside Sable, and pressed his forehead to the wolf's for a long, private moment. Nellie looked away. Davin appeared at her shoulder and handed her a cup of something warm. She took it without questioning what it was and drank it. It turned out to be spiced broth, rich and dark, and it moved through her cold body like something with intentions. "That," Davin said quietly, watching the pups, "is the best thing I've seen in a very long time." Nellie didn't answer, but she thought she agreed. She became aware that Roman was standing behind her, not close, but present, the particular quality of stillness she had learned to identify, the warmth and weight of it at the edge of her awareness. "You should eat," he said. "A proper meal. It's nearly morning." "I'll eat at home," she said. Then, because it was true and mattered, "I'm glad the pups are safe. As am I." He paused. The pause had shape and direction. "You held your agreement to leave when it was done. I'll hold mine. But the road to Grant at this hour is cold and dark, and your horse is unfamiliar with it. Wait until morning light. 2 hours. Then Davin will ride with you." It was reasonable. It was also, she noted, framed as practical consideration, rather than invitation, which meant she could accept it without it meaning anything other than what it was. 2 hours, she said. He nodded once and left the doorway. Davin showed her to a small room off the eastern corridor. Simply furnished, with a low bed, a fire that someone had clearly lit in advance, a basin of warm water, and a folded set of dry clothes left on the chest at the foot of the bed. The clothes were plain and well made, a dress of dark wool and a clean undershirt, and they fit her with a closeness that she did not examine too carefully. She washed her face and hands, changed out of her river-soaked clothes, and sat on the edge of the bed. She had not meant to sleep. She closed her eyes for what she intended to be a moment of stillness, and when she opened them again, the room was full of pale morning light, and the fire had burned to a low, contented glow. She had slept in her sitting position, upright, which explained the particular stiffness in her neck and the fact that she was mildly annoyed with herself. She was braiding her hair with quick, practiced hands when a knock came at the door. 2 knocks, the measured kind. "Come in," she said. It was not Davin. Roman stood in the doorway with the morning light at his back. No longer in his riding cloak, but in a simpler dark tunic, with the leather strap still crossed at his chest. He held a cloth-wrapped parcel in one hand, and he extended it toward her with a directness that had no performance in it. "Bread and dried meat," he said. "For the road." Nellie stood and took the parcel. Their fingers did not touch. She was aware that they did not touch. "Thank you," she said. He did not move to leave immediately. He stood in the doorway in the particular way he had of occupying space, fully without apology, and looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that she had not seen there before. Not the calculating attention of the riverbank, not the quiet observation of the whelping room. Something more unguarded than either of those. "What you did yesterday," he said. Most people would have passed by. The river was fast. The wolf was a stranger. The cold was reason enough. "Most people don't hear what I hear," she said without thinking. He went very still. It was the kind of stillness that had meaning in it. "What did you hear?" he asked quietly. Nellie looked at him. She had not meant to say it, but it was true, and she did not take back true things. "She was afraid," Nellie said. "Not just in pain. Afraid. And I can't walk past something that's afraid." The silence that followed was not the silence of someone forming a response. It was the silence of someone receiving something unexpected and choosing, carefully, what to do with it. "Davin is waiting in the courtyard," Roman said finally. "The road will be clear at this hour." "I'll be down in a moment," she said. He nodded once, turned to leave. Stopped with his back to her, one hand resting on the doorframe. "Nellie of Grent," he said. "Yes? I will remember what you did for Sable." A pause that had the quality of something decided upon. "And I will remember what you just told me." He left. Nellie stood in the small room with the morning light coming through the narrow window, the cloth-wrapped parcel warm in her hands, and looked at the space in the doorway where he had been. Outside in the corridor, the stronghold was waking. She could hear the low sounds of it, boots on stone, voices, the distant clang from the kitchens. A living place, full of a pack going about the business of mourning. She pulled on her gray cloak, picked up her herb basket, and went downstairs. Davin was indeed in the courtyard, holding her horse's reins and looking entirely too pleased with himself for that hour of the morning. "You slept," he said, with the satisfaction of someone whose advice had been taken. "2 hours became several," she said. "The bed is comfortable, I know. Cade chose the furniture for that room himself, which I find quietly devastating to my own self-image." He handed her the reins and swung onto his own horse in one fluid motion. "He also says to tell you that Sable ate this morning, and all 3 pups are nursing well." He said it in 4 words and a grunt, but I have provided the full translation. Something loosened in Nellie's chest that she had not known was still tight. They rode out through the gate as the morning light came low and gold over the ridge, and the valley spread out below them in pale green and gray, the river a dark thread through the trees in the distance. She did not look back at the stronghold. She did not need to. She could feel it behind her, with the same accuracy with which she had felt his presence all through the previous night. Specific, and impossible to explain, and entirely refusing to diminish with distance. Grent was exactly as she had left it. That was the strange thing about returning from something large. The place you came from had no knowledge of it. The village sat in its shallow valley the same way it always sat. The same smoke rising from the same chimneys, the same smell of bread and animals and damp wood that had defined the whole of her life until 36 hours ago. Mrs. Aldrin was beating a rug outside her door. The mill was turning. 2 children were arguing over something near the well, with the focused intensity that only children could sustain over something that would be forgotten by afternoon. Nellie stabled her horse, thanked Davin, and watched him ride back north until the trees took him. Then she went inside. Mara was at the hearth. Mara had been Nellie's closest friend since they were girls. Small and dark-haired, with quick eyes, and the particular brand of intelligence that expressed itself primarily as the ability to know when something had happened before anyone said a word. She looked up when Nellie came through the door, took in the dry borrowed dress, the clean but still damp cloak, the herb basket with its reorganized contents, and the particular expression on Nellie's face that Nellie had not realized she was wearing. "Sit down," Mara said, "and tell me everything." So Nellie sat and told her most of it. The river, the wolf, the 3 men on the bank, the hour in the cold, the ride north, the whelping, the pups, the morning light through the narrow window. She did not mention the way Roman had stood in the doorway with the morning light behind him. She did not mention what she had said about hearing fear, or the quality of the silence that had followed. Some things, once named aloud, took on a weight that she was not certain she was ready to carry in company. Mara listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual enough to confirm that she understood the magnitude of what she was hearing. When Nellie finished, Mara was quiet for a moment. "Roman," she said. "Yes. Roman of Vordenmere." Mara's voice had taken on a careful quality. "Nellie, that's the Lycan king. Not a pack lord, not a regional alpha. The king of the northern courts. He rules every pack from the Ashvorn Valley to the Greyvale Mountains. Every alpha in the northern territories answers to him." "I gathered that," Nellie said, "and he personally rode out to find one wolf. She was pregnant, and Cade. He rode out himself, Nellie. Kings don't do that." Mara looked at her with the focused attention of someone assembling pieces. "What did he look like?" "That is not relevant." "It is extraordinarily relevant." "Mara." "Fine." Mara picked up her cup. "But you're going to think about him every day for a week, and I want you to remember I said that." Nellie did not dignify this with a response, which was more or less a confirmation. She spent the following days in the ordinary rhythm of Grent. She tended the animals that came to her, restocked the herbs she had used at Vordenmere, helped Mrs. Aldrin with a lame goat, and did not think about Roman of Vordenmere any more than was entirely unavoidable, which turned out to be more than she would have liked. It was on the 5th day that the rider came. She was in the yard behind the house, hanging herbs to dry in the pale winter sun, when she heard the horse. It was a single rider, moving at a steady pace through the village, and when she came around the side of the house to look, she found a young man in dark leather with the Vordenmere silver mark on his chest, sitting on a tall horse and looking directly at her as though he had been told exactly where to find her. He extended a folded piece of parchment sealed with dark wax. She broke the seal and read it. The handwriting was direct and unhurried, the letters of someone who wrote to communicate rather than to impress. "Sable and the pups are well. All 3 are nursing, and Cade has not slept more than 2 hours at a time since the night they were born, which I offer without comment. I write for a separate reason. There is a gathering of the northern packs at Vordenmere in 4 days, a council meeting that has been planned for some time. I am told the pack healers will be in attendance, and that there is discussion of a position within the stronghold for someone with knowledge of both animals and plant medicine. I thought you should know that the position exists. The choice is yours. R." Nellie read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and stood in her yard with the winter sun on her face and the dried herbs swaying on their lines above her. She was in Mara's kitchen within the hour. "He wrote to me," she said, and handed over the letter. Mara read it with the focused speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. When she finished, she set it down on the table and looked at Nellie with an expression that mixed satisfaction and genuine seriousness in equal measure. "A council gathering," Mara said. "All the northern alphas in one place. It's a position, a practical one. He found you a reason," Mara said simply. "That's what he did. He found you a reason that isn't about him, so you could say yes, without it meaning more than you're ready for it to mean." Nellie looked at the letter on the table. "That is a very generous interpretation," she said. "It's an accurate one," said Mara. "Are you going?" The gathering was on the 2nd day of the following week. Nellie arrived at Vordenmere as the afternoon light was turning gold over the ridge, and this time the gate opened before she reached it, not because of the man riding beside her, but because the guards recognized her horse. That detail settled somewhere in her chest in a way she did not examine closely. The stronghold was different with the full council in attendance. Every great hall she had imagined was present in the reality. The long tables crowded with men and women in the furs and leathers of different packs, the banners crowding the rafters, the noise and the smoke, and the overlapping scents of a dozen alcatayas packed into one stone hall. It was overwhelming in the way that power was always overwhelming when you encountered it in volume. She was shown to the healer's wing by a young woman named Pell, who had the brisk efficiency of someone who managed large amounts of information and did not enjoy wasting either her time or yours. The position, Pell explained, involved care of the pack's animals, maintenance of the medicinal stores, and consultation with the pack healers on cases involving both. It was not a grand title. It was necessary work, the kind that required genuine knowledge and produced real consequences. Nellie understood necessary work. She had done it her whole life. She met the pack healers, 3 of them, ranging from a sharp-eyed older woman named Sarah, who tested her herb knowledge with the thoroughness of someone who had been disappointed before and intended not to be again, to a quiet young man named Barrett, who communicated primarily by showing her things rather than explaining them. She passed Sarah's examination. She and Barrett understood each other within the first 10 minutes. She saw Roman at the evening meal in the great hall. He was at the head of the long table, between 2 pack lords whose names Pell had given her earlier, broad men with the particular density of alphas who had held territory for a long time. He was listening to something the man on his left was saying, his forearms on the table. His attention fully given in the way she had noticed was characteristic of him. He did not look around the hall in the restless way that men with power sometimes did, confirming that they were being observed. He simply occupied his place at the head of the table and attended to what was directly in front of him. He noticed her when she entered. She knew because the quality of his stillness shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she had spent enough time being aware of his presence to read its changes. He did not turn his head immediately. When he did, it was with the same unhurried directness with which he did everything, and the look he gave her across the length of the crowded hall was brief and unambiguous. "You came." She held his gaze for a moment. "I came." Then she sat down at the lower end of the table between Pell and Barrett, and accepted the bowl of stew that appeared in front of her, and did not look toward the head of the table again for the remainder of the meal, a discipline she maintained with only moderate success. It was after the meal, when the hall had loosened into smaller conversations and the fire had been built up high against the night cold, that Davin materialized at her elbow with a cup of wine and the expression of someone arriving at the interesting part of a story. "He hasn't stopped looking at you since you walked in," Davin said pleasantly. "I say this as a statement of observable fact, not as gossip, because I have too much self-respect for gossip." "That is an extraordinary claim," Nellie said. "The looking or the self-respect?" "Both." Davin smiled into his cup. "You fit here, you know. It's strange. People usually need time before Vordenmere feels anything other than enormous. You walked in as though the stones already knew you." Nellie looked at the hall around her. The high dark walls, the torch brackets, the layered smells of wood smoke and old oak, and the particular warmth that came from a large fire in a stone room full of living people. She thought about Grent, its smallness and its familiarity, the life that was waiting 2 leagues south and had been waiting her whole life. A life that fit her the way a coat fits when it has been worn so long it no longer has a shape of its own. She thought about a wolf in a river, afraid and alone, and the way she had not been able to walk past it. She thought about the letter folded in her cloak pocket. "The choice is yours." "Maybe," she said quietly. Across the hall, without looking, she knew exactly where Roman was standing. That night, after the gathering had thinned and the torches had burned low, she walked the eastern corridor alone and stopped at the door of the room where Sable was kept. She opened it quietly. Sable lifted her head. The 3 pups were a heap of dark gray fur against her side, sleeping with the absolute totality that only newborns managed. The wolf looked at Nellie with those gold eyes, steady and clear, and then set her head back down with a slow exhale that contained, somehow, the particular quality of an animal that knows it is safe. Nellie sat on the floor beside the bedding for a long while, her back against the wall, in the warm room with the low fire, listening to the small sounds of 3 new lives breathing. When she finally rose to leave, Roman was standing in the corridor outside the door. He had not been there when she entered. She did not ask how long he had been there. Some questions answered themselves. "She looked for you," he said, "when you sat with her." "She remembered the river," Nellie said. "Yes," he said. And then, very quietly, with the directness that she was coming to understand, was simply how he said true things. "So do I." The corridor was narrow and lit by a single torch that threw long shadows against the old stone. He was close enough that she could see the scar along his jaw clearly, pale against the dark stubble, and the careful, unguarded quality of his expression that she had only seen once before. In the doorway of her room, in the morning light, when he had not known she was watching him form it. She did not step back. Neither did he. "The position," she said. "I'd like to take it." Something in his face shifted, the way light shifts on water when something beneath it moves. "Then it's yours," he said. Winter deepened over Vordenmere in the weeks that followed, and Nellie learned the stronghold the way she learned everything, through use. She learned which stones in the eastern corridor were uneven and would catch an unwary boot in low light. She learned that the medicinal stores were organized by Sarah's system, which was logical once you understood that Sarah's mind categorized by effect rather than by plant family, and that arguing with the system was less productive than learning it. She learned that Barrett, who almost never spoke, would occasionally appear at her shoulder with exactly the herb she had been about to reach for, which she found both useful and slightly unnerving. She learned that Cade visited Sable and the pups every morning, before the rest of the stronghold woke, and that if you happened to be in the eastern wing at that hour, you would find the largest man in Vordenmere sitting on the floor with 3 wolf pups climbing over him with absolute impunity, while he pretended to find this undignified. She learned the rhythms of the pack, the way you learned a language. First the individual words, then the grammar, then finally the point at which you stopped translating and simply understood. Roman, she learned more slowly and more carefully, because he was not a thing that yielded itself quickly. He came to the healer's wing twice in the first week on practical matters. Once to ask about a remedy for a scout who had returned with a deep cold in his chest. Once to consult on an injury one of the horses had taken on the northern road. Both times he stayed longer than the question required. Not much longer. But the margin was consistent and deliberate, and Nellie was not a person who missed consistent and deliberate things. They talked in the way that people talk when they are both intelligent enough to know that what they are really doing is learning each other, carefully, with genuine interest, allowing the conversation to go where it went without forcing it toward anything. She learned that he had led Vordenmere since he was 23, when his father died in a territorial dispute that had left scars on the pack that were still visible if you knew where to look. She learned that he read extensively, which explained the maps and volumes she had noticed on his desk when she had passed the open door of his study. She learned that he held silences with the same attention he held conversations, which was rare enough that she found it notable. He learned that she had grown up knowing she was different without having a clear name for what different meant. That animals had always come to her, not because she coaxed them, but because something in their instinct recognized something in hers, a frequency she had never been able to explain. That she had spent most of her life in a village that valued her practically, and understood her imperfectly, and that she had made a kind of peace with that gap without ever quite filling it. She did not plan to tell him that last part. It arrived in the conversation on its own, the way true things sometimes did when you had stopped defending the door. He listened without filling the pause that followed it, which was exactly the right thing to do. It was Sarah who told her, on a cold afternoon in the 5th week, with the directness of a woman who had long since stopped softening things she considered simply true. "You know what you are, girl?" Sarah said, without looking up from the roots she was sorting. "A healer's assistant with inadequate experience in bone setting," Nellie said. "Your bone setting is fine." Sarah set down a root and looked at her. "Your mother's line. Where was she from?" "The South. She died when I was young. I didn't know much of her family." "Her name?" "Elsa. Her family name was Vane." Sarah went very still in the way that Nellie had learned meant she was processing something significant. "Vein," Sarah repeated. "Yes." The older woman was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving over Nellie's face with an assessment that felt different from the herb examinations. Older, more searching. "The vein line," Sarah said carefully, was one of the original Omega bloodlines of the Northern Courts. Not common Omegas, the old kind. Bloodline Omegas, who carried a resonance that predated pack hierarchy. They could hear distress in animals and people alike. They were drawn to pain the way water runs toward low ground. She paused. The line was thought to have ended 2 generations ago. The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the stone battlements with a low sound like breathing. "That's why the animals come to you," Sarah said simply. "That's why Sable looked at you on the riverbank. She didn't just recognize kindness. She recognized your blood. An animal of that line, a royal guard wolf, would have known what you were before you knew yourself." Nellie looked at her hands. She thought about the river, the weight of the wolf, the cold water. She thought about every animal that had appeared at the edge of the forest her whole life, injured and afraid, and somehow certain she would be there. "Does it change anything?" she asked. "It explains things," Sarah said. "Whether it changes them is up to you." She told Roman that evening. She had not planned to. She had planned to sit with it alone for several days, the way she sat with most things that needed processing. But when she found herself in his study at the end of the day, he had asked her to look at a reference in one of his volumes regarding a particular herb used in the South, and she had come in with the genuine intention of finding the page and leaving. She looked up from the book and found him watching her from across the desk with that particular quality of attention. And she simply told him. All of it. Sarah's words, the vein bloodline, the old Omega resonance, what it meant about why animals came to her, what it meant about Sable on the riverbank. He listened without interrupting, leaning back in his chair with his forearms on the rests, his pale eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I know about the vein line," he said. Sarah thought it had ended. So did most people. He paused. "My father's records mention them. He had a theory that bloodline Omegas didn't disappear. They dispersed, moved away from pack territories into ordinary villages, had ordinary lives, and the resonance passed to daughters who didn't know what they were carrying." "Like me," Nellie said. "Like you." She looked at him across the desk, in the fire-lit study with its maps and volumes, and the smell of old paper and wood smoke, and said the thing that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Sarah's words that afternoon. "Is that why you noticed me? On the riverbank?" she asked. "The bloodline." He held her gaze with the directness that was simply his nature. "I noticed you," he said, "because you were in a cold river pulling a wolf to safety with your bare hands, and your first concern when you got her to shore was whether she was afraid." A pause, precise and deliberate. "The bloodline explains the animals. It doesn't explain what I felt on that bank. That was you." The fire shifted in the hearth. The wind moved outside the stone walls. Nellie held what he had said in the space between them for a moment, and then she set down the book and came around the side of the desk and stood before him, close enough that there was no ambiguity about intention. "I'm not good at things I can't explain," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "I've been trying to explain you for 6 weeks. Have you managed it?" "No," he said. "I've stopped trying." He reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face, with a touch so careful it felt like a question and an answer at the same time. And Nellie closed the remaining distance and let herself be exactly where she was, which was where she had been moving toward since a cold afternoon on the bank of the Ashbourne River, with mud on her boots, and a wolf's heartbeat under her hands. Spring came late to Vordenmere, but it came completely, the way things come when they have been held back long enough. The valley below the ridge turned from gray to green in the space of 2 weeks, and the river that had tried to take Sable was running clear and fast between its banks, carrying snowmelt from the northern peaks with a brightness that was almost aggressive after the long winter. Sable's pups were large enough now to tumble through the inner courtyard under Cade's approximately supervisory attention, which mostly consisted of him standing with his arms crossed while they climbed his boots and pretended not to be charmed. The Council of the Northern Packs was called for the 3rd week of spring, and this time Nellie sat at the long table not at the lower end with the staff, but at Roman's right hand, where Davin had been the previous season. Davin had moved 1 seat down with the particular expression of someone who considers themselves the architect of a satisfying outcome. There were eyes on her. She was aware of that. The pack lords and their representatives who had not been present at the winter gathering looked at her with the calculating attention of people who assessed unfamiliar things at high-value tables. Some of those looks contained skepticism. A few contained something that sharpened into hostility when Roman addressed her directly, consulted her opinion on the healer's report she had prepared, and then turned to the rest of the table with an authority that did not explain itself or ask for approval. She had prepared the report carefully. It was accurate, thorough, and specific. When questions came, she answered them with the straightforward competence of someone who knew what they knew and did not apologize for knowing it. The skeptical looks shifted as the meeting progressed. Not all of them, but most. After the council, when the hall had cleared and the long tables were being reset for the evening meal, a man approached her near the eastern corridor. She recognized him from the meeting, Lord Edric of the Greymore Pack, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, with the particular watchfulness of a man who had survived long enough to distrust quick impressions. "You're the woman from Gwent," he said. "The one who pulled the king's wolf from the river." "Yes," she said. He studied her for a moment. "My pack has needed a bloodline healer for 3 generations," he said. "I didn't think I'd see one in my lifetime." He nodded once, the nod of someone updating a long-held position. The king chose well. He walked away before she could respond. She found Roman in the corridor outside the great hall, leaning against the wall in the unhurried way he had when he was waiting without urgency. He had clearly been there for the tail end of Lord Edric's words. "Chose well," he repeated, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who does not often permit themselves to look satisfied. "Don't be smug," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I'm right. Those are different things." She laughed, a real one, the kind that arrived without announcement, and he watched it happen with an expression that was entirely unguarded, the face beneath the authority, the one that she had come to know as the truest version of him. The pack gathered at midsummer for the formal bonding rite, in the old way of the Lycan courts. No performance, no ceremony for its own sake. Only the pack assembled in the great hall, and the declaration made before witnesses who had known Roman since he was young, and who looked at Nellie with the careful attention of people deciding whether she was equal to the thing she was being offered. She stood beside him in her own clothes, the dark wool dress, her gray cloak, her hair braided simply, and did not pretend to be anything other than what she was. A woman from a small village with mud on her history, and a bloodline she had only recently learned to name, who had waded into a cold river without thinking, and come out the other side of an entirely different life. Roman spoke the declaration in the old tongue of the northern courts, and when it was done, the hall was quiet for a moment, the held-breath quality of something that has just become permanent. Cade struck the table with his fist once, hard, in the way of the northern packs, and the hall answered. Mara was in the 3rd row. She had ridden up from Gwent 2 days before, and had spent most of the time since looking around the stronghold with the expression of someone whose most generous predictions had been exceeded. When the hall answered Cade's strike, she was crying openly and making no effort whatsoever to conceal it, which Nellie found simultaneously endearing and deeply unhelpful to her own composure. Sable's pups, no longer pups but young wolves with the particular confidence of animals raised in a place where they were loved, were in the eastern courtyard when Nellie crossed it that evening. The largest of the three, a dark gray female with her mother's gold eyes, pressed her head against Nellie's hand and held still for a moment in the old way, the way animals did when they were not asking for anything, but simply acknowledging something that was true. Nellie stood in the courtyard with the last of the summer light on the stone walls and the sound of the pack inside the stronghold behind her, and felt, with a clarity she had no desire to examine or explain or qualify, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had been led here, not because a bloodline had written it, but because on a cold afternoon on the bank of the Ashvorn River, she had heard something afraid and had not walked past it. Everything else had followed from that. The wolf, the king, the life she had not known she was walking toward. Roman found her there, as he had a way of finding her, without announcement, without urgency, simply present. He stood beside her in the fading light and looked out over the valley as she was looking, and neither of them spoke for a long moment because they had long since learned that their silences said the same things their words did. When he finally spoke, it was quietly, and it was simple. "Are you well?" he asked. She looked at the valley, the river, just visible in the distance, threading through the darkening trees, the last of the light on the water. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. The valley settled into evening below them. The torches were lit on the battlements above. Inside the stronghold, the pack moved through the business of the night. Voices, fire, the sounds of a living place that knew what it was and who it belonged to. Nellie and Roman stood in the courtyard until the first stars appeared over the ridge, and the life they had built together from a cold river and a pregnant wolf and one unguarded afternoon settled around them like something permanent. It was. It would remain so. That was the end of it, and it was enough.